So today is the second part in our lecture series on the development of existentialism, which, if you guys remember, is finding meaning in a meaningless world, right? Which is very important in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, especially. And today we're going to look at Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. This is probably one of my favorite lectures to that I've written, because these guys are very, very interesting. Schopenhauer comes first. And then Nietzsche. Nietzsche. Okay. So, last time we looked at Kant, who said to prove his, universal morals, he needed something called a synthetic a priori knowledge, right? This was some boring shit last time, but it is very important, because you need to say something, to make a claim that says we need to respect everyone, right? You need that claim needs to be synthetic, so it doesn't contain the definition in itself, because to respect everyone, we can't know whether or not this is true just by looking at it and thinking about it, right? And so this must be synthetic, but it also has to be this doesn't contain the definition in itself, right? We need to respect everyone. It's not just automatically true. And so, but we still need to know it just by thinking. And so how can this synthetic a priori knowledge, shut up, how can this be possible, right? He says, well, it might be possible to say the limits of our experience is limited by space and time, right? That's something that's not automatically true just by looking at it, because it doesn't contain the definition in itself, right? And it's also a priori, because we don't need to go and observe something to know that we're limited by space and time, right? And so this transcendental, these transcendental limitations are synthetic a priori, because we know them just by thinking. We don't have to observe anything. And they're also not contained in itself, right? And that's how he proves that this type of knowledge is possible with transcendental reasoning, right? And he goes back and he says, wait a minute, I'm straight up cooking with this transcendental limitation. I'm onto something. And then he makes a whole ass philosophy out of his transcendental arguments, the fact that our limitations, our experience is limited by something. He goes and makes this entire philosophy out of it, and he calls it transcendental idealism. So transcendental idealism is the idea that the world in itself, the real world, and the world that we see, that we can experience, are two different things, right? So remember the analogy of putting on these glasses, these limits of space and time, right? And then we see this whiteboard eraser with the lens of space and time. We see it in terms of space and time. But if we take off the glasses, right, and we see the thing in itself, then it's just this it's this blob of everything else outside of space and time, and we don't know what it is. Right? We don't know what it is. We can only understand the thing in terms of our own transcendental aesthetics, our limits to our experience, right? And so he says there are two worlds. There's the phenomenal world, the world that we can observe. So in the phenomenal world, it's just chocolate. But it's only real for us. It's a world that's only acceptable. It's a world that's only available to us, right? It's phenomenons. Phenomenons are things that we can observe, right? But then he says outside of the phenomenal world, there's something called the noumenal world. And that's the world in its full representation, right? The world in its full everything, right? Outside of space and time, outside of what we can see of the electromagnetic spectrum, outside of our hearing range, everything else, right? The world, the thing in itself, he says. Right? And then this noumenal world, it's unknowable. It's foreign to us. We can never know what it is. Because we're limited to the phenomenal world. You guys know why we're limited to the phenomenal world, right? Because we're limited by space and time. That's transcendentally. We can't transcend it, right? It's transcendentally our limitations. It's called transcendental aesthetics. Right. So that's Kant and his transcendental idealism. Idealism is like, it's a subject-focused theory, right? Because like, you have the subject, which is the person observing the object. You guys know what a subject is, right? A subject is something that's doing the observation. We're subjects, right? And then a phone is an object, the chair is an object. We're the ones observing them, right? And then so, this is where Schopenhauer...
Right, Thomas?
Yeah?
So if we get observed, are we the object then?
You're also a subject. You guys are both subjects.
Will he observe me?
I guess you're an object to him, and then, but like you're both subjects,
Yeah.
right? You're both doing the observation.
Yeah.
Right?
Is this phone a subject because it's observing you?
No, because it doesn't have a consciousness.
How do you know that?
There's a few ways to prove
It
it.
doesn't have the capacity to reason.
Yeah, it doesn't have the. It's just, even if it were a subject, we wouldn't know, right?
Is a giraffe a subject?
Yes, a giraffe is a subject, but it's not on the same level as us because it doesn't have the same transcendental aesthetics, right? A giraffe might see different shades of the electromagnetic spectrum, might have different hearing ranges. It has different transcendental aesthetics as us, right?
What's the thing about blind people? They have like different.
Yeah. But like, yes, he says he says our transcendental aesthetics is not just like observable light and like things like that. He says it's just space-time and our ability to reason, right? Space and time. Like, you can't even imagine a world without space and time. Like, try it. Go ahead and try it. You can't, right? You can think of empty space, but that's still space.
It's just like everything.
Yeah, it's just everything. We can't even imagine something outside of space and time, and we can't imagine anything without our modes of reasoning. And so these three things are
But like,
our
you
limitations.
can see, you can like imagine color, but if you're blind, you can't even imagine color, right? You can't imagine what.
But like, space and time are the important things, right? Yeah. Okay. Anyways, this is where Schopenhauer starts his philosophy, right? Schopenhauer is completely based on Kant, as well as Buddhism. Okay. So one concept you guys need to understand is that like the East and the West. Wait, Aaron.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys know about like the East and the West, right? The West is like European, like Europe, and then the East is like China and places like that, right? The East and West, they've evolved their separate philosophies. They've never really interacted. Their philosophy have never really interacted. So in the East, you got like Buddhism, and then you have like Confucius, and then in the West, we have like everything we've learned about ethics, right? So what Schopenhauer did was he went and studied Buddhism. He took Eastern philosophies and he imported it to the West. He was the first person to do this, right? And he's such an important philosopher. He's one of those people who just influenced everyone who came after him. Okay, absolutely, probably top 10 in my opinion. Goated. So you guys know how Kant says in the noumenal world there's things in themselves, right? And these are things that we can't tell. We don't know what they are, right? Schopenhauer says, I know what it is. I figured it out. I know what the things in themselves are. I know what the noumenal world is. And that's his whole philosophy, right? But first of all, some background on Schopenhauer. He lived a pretty miserable life, okay? None of his works were recognized officially until after he died, right? When he was alive, he was always ignored, and then later fucking died. Wait, what am I saying? So like, there was someone else called Hegel who lived at the same time as him, was way more famous than him, right? And he's like, wait, guys, Hegel's literally yapping. But then like, nobody believed him. And then now we know that Hegel's literally yapping, and we barely listen to Hegel anymore. And then Schopenhauer now, he's really famous. But when he was alive, he was not recognized at all, right? And then his work was such a flop. His work called The World as Will and Representation. This is a really This is his most important work. This is ethics part.
What? Dirty scum.
Right. His book, The World as World and Representation, was such a flop that he spent the rest of his life trying to explain this book. All the other books he published was trying to explain this book, right? So basically, he wasn't taken very seriously, but now he's fucking famous as fuck. So this title was actually beautifully written, okay? This title, it's beautifully written because we can take it apart and just get like a really good understanding of his philosophy, okay? So will and representation, right? Guys, shh. Okay, so the will, guys. Oh, my bad. Okay, so the will and the representation. So what is the will? Right? What is the will? The will is what he says the noumenal world is, right? So this is kind of a difficult concept to explain. He says the will is the driving force behind everything, the entire universe, and it's all one thing, right? The whole universe. He took this from Buddhism, right? And he says the whole universe is interconnected by this thing called the will. And the will is not like a human will or anything. It's a force. It's an unconscious, subjective force, right? And the wills, they all express a desire for something, right? And then, so, if the entire universe are wills, everything's made up of like these aggregations, these sums of the will, and then they turn into these objects, right? That are called representations. So you guys can imagine the will as like this random field of arrows, right? It's like this, right? It's guys. So you guys can imagine the will as like a bunch of random arrows, okay? And then when two arrows come together, they make this tree.
Vector diagram.
You make a tree, and that's a representation. That's one of the images that the will creates, right? That's a tree, and then when a bunch of arrows come together, when a bunch of these desires come together, you get a human, right? And a human is the highest form of representation that the will can take. Because look, a tree, what kind of desires does a tree have, right? Very little, maybe like the desire to reproduce, right? And then, but a human, we have so many desires. We have like the desire for love, for achievement, for all these things, right? And then, as a collection, we're not like the highest order of being for Schopenhauer, right? And if the world is made up of these unconscious desires, right? He says, so having desire and then not having it fulfilled leads to suffering, right? Do you guys agree with that? Like, if you have a desire and it's not fulfilled, it's suffering, right? And since we can never accomplish all of our desires, suffering is something that's guaranteed in our lives, right? Suffering is like the default.
Yep.
So he says life is always just this like suffering and meaninglessness, right? And you can't avoid it. You can't avoid suffering. That's one of his main points. Can't avoid it. So his ethics, right, based on his idea that the world is like a whole thing, it's a whole, and then he says any individuality that you experience, like you think you're an individual, he says that's all just an illusion, right? We're not actually individuals. We're actually just like this complex web of the will. That's what he says the noumenal world is, right? And then so his ethics is basically says he basically says we shouldn't be motivated by moral rules like what Kant says. Kant says we need to act under moral rules, right? He says our ethics should be acting under compassion, right? Because compassion arises when we realize that the world is one universe, right? It's a whole, right? We're all just little parts. We're all equal parts of the world, right? And so the suffering of someone else, which he says everything is about suffering, right? The suffering of someone else is the same as yours, right? And so the just person, the good person, according to Schopenhauer, is someone who realizes that the world is it's all the same, and someone who can see the suffering of other people so clearly that you'd think it was your own, right? And then this person would be willing to suffer himself to alleviate the suffering of others. Right? That's what a good person under Schopenhauer is. Because for that person who's realized that everything he's just a part of the universe, then you know suffering for this other person and suffering for yourself is really the same thing. Right? It's the same thing. And he says, well, how can you escape the suffering, right? Can you kill yourself? Well, not really, because if you kill yourself, you'll just take a different representation. Because the world is like this aimless, like the directionless arrows, right? And like you'll just come back as a different representation, and that's a Buddhist idea as well, the idea of reincarnation, right?
As anything.
Yeah.
It's like random chances.
Yeah, so it's a world of random chance and like reincarnation, right? And so he says, even if you kill yourself, you're just gonna keep suffering because you might end the instance of suffering for your representation, the representation of you, right? But like you're going to exist as part of the will, and the suffering doesn't end. And so he says, how do you then reduce your suffering? He offers a way, right? And this is also very Buddhist. He says the only way to reduce suffering is to not expect very much, because suffering comes from not achieving your desires, right? And so if you don't desire anything, you can't suffer, right? And so he says the only way to not suffer very much is to not expect to be very happy. So lower your expectations, lower your desires, and then you'll be happy, right? And this has come back as a wave of like this has come back as a really big movement in China. Have you guys heard about like lying flat? No, nobody's heard about lying flat. Okay, so like due to like the really competitive Chinese society, right? A lot of like young adults, they're just not doing anything. They're just giving up, right? Millions of young adults, because they can't find a job, right? So they just give up, right? That's literally Schopenhauer, because like he says, if you don't desire anything, you won't suffer, right? Because suffering comes from desiring things and not being able to meet them. And so these young people, they're just like, okay, we're not gonna try. We're not gonna desire jobs. We're not gonna desire these things. And then if we live, we're not gonna suffer. Yeah?
Is boredom suffering?
Is boredom suffering? That's a good point.
Because wouldn't they be really bored? So that's also a form of suffering, no?
Well, boredom is more like a desire to satisfy something, right? And so like they've reduced their desires as much as they can, but like the desire to do something without being bored is probably still something that they do, like the desire to eat, the desire to drink, and so like and the desire to not be bored, they're like very very basic necessities that like we can still do. I'm talking about like the desire to like do great things, right? They've given up on that. They think that it's meaningless, right? And so Schopenhauer is very pessimistic. He's very very nihilistic. Have you guys? Yeah.
If you do things just for the sake of doing it without expecting anything, will you therefore gain a net positive and be happy?
Well, what if you don't succeed?
Yeah, but you didn't expect anything.
How can you do something without expecting anything?
I don't know. Maybe you just wanted to start a project, but you don't expect anything.
Well, yeah, like you guys have a bunch of problems with this theory, right? And that's because like this theory is probably wrong. A lot of the things Schopenhauer says is wrong, but he's very, very influential. Like for example, his thing of the will, right? I don't believe in any of that, right? But what we can believe is some of the things he says. Like for example, suffering is guaranteed in life, right? If you believe in that, right? And then another thing is, suffering comes as a result of desires, and all humans have desires. That's something that's acceptable. Another thing is that life doesn't have any inherent meaning, right? Because his will is just this swirling, like always like moving about and constant desire. His will is like a constant collection of desires, right? And it's insatiable. You can't satisfy it, right? And so once you realize this, he says, people will look at the human condition and be like, wait, this is meaningless. This is meaningless suffering, and they will be repulsed by it, right? That's what he says someone would react, right? But like, that's kind of really nihilistic and really bad, right? And so maybe Schopenhauer's reaction is wrong, and that's what Friedrich Nietzsche says, right? Friedrich Nietzsche says, okay, Schopenhauer, thanks for telling us that life is meaningless and shit, but like, your reaction is kind of cringe. And so, how do we react to a meaningless world then? In terms of Nietzsche, a world where everyone suffers, right? Yep. Hello. Yeah, that's fine. So we've established through Schopenhauer's theory that like suffering is guaranteed in life, right? And then all humans have like these desires that can't be satisfied, and then that leads to suffering, right? And life is also meaningless, okay? And then Friedrich Nietzsche's like, damn, that's really bad. So how do I deal with this, right? How do I deal with the suffering? And he says, suffering doesn't have to be bad. Suffering can actually be its own sort of romance, right? Because if we're the only formations, we're the only representations of the will with this much desire, right? We have desires that are like achievement, ambition, freedom, and things like that, and no other animal has. No other representation has the same desires as us. And these grand goals, if we choose to follow them in spite of the suffering, then it's taking a brave leap towards like a goal. And that's how we make meaning for ourselves. Because if we aim for these things, and then we take the bravery to take all the suffering in order to reach these things, right? Our goals, like freedom, even though we know that there's going to be suffering, that's going to bring us meaning, right? And suffering, even if we don't achieve those things, suffering can be beautiful, right? Art comes from suffering, literature comes from suffering, and it's not just this meaningless thing that's bad. Suffering is not bad. It can actually be beautiful, and it can bring us meaning. And that's what Friedrich Nietzsche says, right? And he gives us these two analogies, right? He says, here's the two ways that someone can react to nihilism, right? Nihilism is the idea that there's no inherent meaning in the world, and then we just have to like satisfy our desires and shit, right? He says there's the last man. Something he calls the last man. The last man is just like, well, okay, he thinks that life has no meaning, and then he just takes drugs and do whatever makes him happy, right? And then he doesn't aim for anything. That's what Schopenhauer says. He doesn't aim for anything. He curbs all his desires, and then he just does the bare minimum. And he says that's really bad, right? In contrast, we can be something called the Übermensch.
Oh my god. Is that?
We can be the Superman, right? And what is a Superman? What is a Nietzschean Superman? Nietzsche says we can react to this nihilism, right, by taking the desires that are unique to us, to humans, right, like the desire for freedom, the desire for achievement, right, and then we can be brave enough to act on those goals, even though we know that there's suffering coming, right? And if we do that, then we successfully give meaning to ourselves, and we champion this meaningless world, right? Because we found meaning in ourselves. Because of the goals that we have, right? We desire these things. And so that makes our struggles not meaningless, because we're struggling to achieve this thing. That's literally, that's what meaning is, right? Struggling to achieve something, right? So he says, we all have this will to power. Like, Schopenhauer's will. Like he says in humans, the will takes a different form. And then he says we all have this will to power. We all want to be powerful. We all want to achieve something, right? And then as long as we can follow this, because most people don't have the bravery, don't have the courage to follow this will to power. But as long as we do have the bravery to do this, we can do great things. We can become these Ubermensch, right? And for example, some examples of people who do this are like Nelson Mandela, right? They face the oppressive society, right? The society that stops them from being what they want, from reaching power, right? And they face it, even if they might die, right? Because they find meaning in pursuing this thing, right? This goal. They find meaning in pursuing a goal, and in doing so, they even give meaning to other people, right? The people who follow them. Another example is Adolf Hitler, right? Like, Hitler is most definitely someone who...
My favorite politician.
Yeah, someone who's very driven by this will to power,
Yep.
right? And he has these very big goals. And Germany at the time was very depressing, right? But he made these people less depressed, and he made these people think, yeah, we're it, we're the goats, right? He gave these people meaning, right? An Ubermensch comes very few, right? There's very few Ubermensch, but they give everyone else this sort of meaning, and it allows them to keep existing, right? And so that's how Nietzsche says we should react to nihilism. It's like, yeah, nihilism means like there's no meaning in life, right? But we should just, since there's no meaning in life, we should be free from all societal restrictions and just aim at what makes us happy. Right? We should just do whatever makes us happy. But doing whatever makes us happy is going to entail a lot of suffering, right? A lot of suffering is going to come from that, because not everybody wants you to do that, right? And so he says, as long as we're brave enough to follow our desires, we can be meaningful. We can live meaningful lives, even if the universe itself is inherently meaningless. And yeah, that's Kant, Nietzsche, and Schopenhauer, and that's their takes on existentialism. Yay!
Nice.
So if you guys think about Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, you guys can probably see why this would apply, right? You can say Maggie isn't revenge. You can say Maggie is, you know,
Skip it for no particular reason.
I don't know. But like Maggie is more of an absurdist character, and we'll look at absurdism next time, actually, to complete our lecture series. Okay, thank you guys. Yeah, I know, it's so annoying.
Wait, what?
We're the most serious students.
Shut up. We inclusive.